Hello and welcome to this very special digital event, Thomas Becket, Church and State. My name is Naomi Speakman and I am the co-curator of the British Museum's current exhibition, Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint, which is on until the 22nd of August. And on behalf of the British Museum, it is my great pleasure to moderate proceedings today and to welcome our two speakers, the Right Reverend Rose Hudson-Wilkin, the Suffragan Bishop of Dover, and the Right Reverend and Right Honourable Lord Williams of Oystermouth, who served as the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. Today, they will be discussing the dispute between Thomas Becket and Henry II and the effect it has had on the relationship between church and state then and now. At the end of the discussion, there will be some time available for us to answer your questions. And if you would like to submit a question to the two speakers, you can do so using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So first of all, I'm going to explain a little bit about the format. And for this event, I will be directing questions to our two speakers. And together they will be exploring several themes, including the monarchy, the relationship between the church and state today, the law, and lessons to be learned from Thomas Becket. Now, who better to explore these questions than our two speakers who are leading figures within the Anglican Church and who have had first-hand and continue to have first-hand experience of these matters. Before being appointed as Bishop of Dover, Bishop Rose has previously served as chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons and as chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen, as well as serving as a member of the General Synod of the Church of England, and that is to name just a few of her appointments. Lord Williams served as Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 to 2012, after which he became the 35th Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, which he retired from just last year. He is a noted scholar and theologian who has lectured and written on a wide range of matters, not least Thomas Becket and ecclesiastical law. So, Rowan, could you begin proceedings for us today by telling us a bit more about Becket and Henry's dispute? Why was it so important? And what did it mean for the relationship between church and crown?
Thank you, Naomi. Well, the debate between Henry and Becket is often presented as if it were simply a matter of King Henry wanting to impose the same law for everybody in his dominions, and the church resisting that and saying, well, no, church people, churchmen particularly, must have special treatment. They're not to be treated just on the same level as everyone else. And if you come at it that way, it looks like an open and shut case. Henry is really on the side of what we would regard as the rule of law, and Thomas Becket is on the side of special exemptions for special groups. But as I say, it's not nearly so simple. What Henry wanted was the freedom as the monarch to determine the law as he saw it. The appeal to ancestral custom as something that mattered in defining the law was something that Henry really wanted to be able to settle for himself. He had the right to say what the ancestral customs were. And Becket's resistance to that was, at least in part, a resistance to the idea that the sovereign power in the state can actually just say and do what it wants to. He's saying there are other kinds of belonging, there are other kinds of affiliation in a society, not just what the sovereign power declares. And the law, when it's acting justly, has to take into consideration different kinds of community, different kinds of affiliation, different kinds of belonging, and make sure, yes, that everyone has justice, but that justice takes account of the layered and complex tapestry of human society. So that's putting it in rather modern terms, but certainly one of the things that Becket is resisting is an absolutism vested in a single sovereign power who can declare what counts as law. Becket is saying, no, we have a community here, the church, which has its own law, its own custom, its own tradition, and the state has to take that seriously too.
And could you tell us some more about the specifics of what Becket himself believed he was defending or was defending, and what were the central issues that were of concern to Henry?
The immediate trigger for a lot of the debate was what came to be called the issue of criminous clerks, that is, men in holy orders, which wasn't just priests and bishops and deacons, it was also a whole lot of people in what were called minor orders who held very junior office in the church. Should people who held holy orders be punished in the same courts and by the same system as everybody else? And as I say, it sounds like an open and shut case, but there'd already been quite a lot of debate about this in the centuries before, because punishments in the local courts of barons and feudal lords could be a lot more severe than in the church courts, and the church courts assumed that their job was to help people repent, not just to punish people. So the issue was quite a complex one. Becket believed he had to defend, he was absolutely bound to defend the right of the church courts to treat offences as they saw fit, and to invoke the idea that the law existed in order to produce repentance, not just to secure punishment. And while that's had a pretty complex history in the development of law and society since then, the important point is that Becket saw the law as something which had a pastoral element in dealing with the officials of the church. And the law of the feudal state, especially the law as guaranteed by the supreme magistrate in the country, which was the monarch, that law didn't have that reformatory and pastoral element, and it depended really on rectifying what you might call a disturbed balance of obligations between all the different kinds of duties and commitments that feudal society involved. So two different kinds of society, not just two different ideas of law colliding here.
That's really interesting. I think what you're saying there, Rowan, about the different societies as well as the different approaches to law. But before we move on to the present day, I wonder if you could also tell us a bit more about how successful Becket's defence of the rights of the church was, and was Henry successful in achieving what he set out to do?
Henry certainly won the battle and lost the war in the immediate short term. That's to say, the shock of Becket's murder did him no favours at all in the years immediately following. But I think that shock certainly helped to entrench the idea that the law of the church was in some sense protected by the law of the land. Not running side by side, not in open collision, but protected with its liberties. So when Magna Carta comes along, the first item in Magna Carta is, let the English church be free. And that freedom meant the freedom to determine its own discipline, basically. So Becket, you could say, won that round, but nonetheless, the issues don't go away. So the right of the king to appoint people to church offices, the right of the king to call in church revenues when there are vacancies in appointments to bishoprics and so on, that goes on being a contested matter right through the Middle Ages, until, of course, Henry VIII takes a kind of hatchet to the whole thing and says, well, let's get rid of the dual system. Let's get rid of the complexity of appeals around or beyond the monarch. Let's get rid of any doubt that the monarch has the right to appoint leaders in the church. And you have the declaration in the 1530s of the supremacy in all things, in all causes, that is, in all legal matters, of the crown. So round two, you might say, goes to the next aggressive King Henry in the story, Henry VIII. I suspect we're still possibly in round three, but let's come back to that in a moment, maybe.
Interesting. I would like to hear more about round three at some point. That's some very useful context for us. Thank you so much, Rowan. And I'd like to bring this conversation up to the present day now, and also address a question to you, Rose. And you were previously chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons. So could you tell us a bit about what it's like to be working in the church in the heart of government in our own age? And Do you see that role changing?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I should begin by saying that when I applied for the role as chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons, the reason I did so was because I felt deeply and passionately that faith should be in the public square and that there should be no no-go areas when it comes to faith. And so that's what encouraged me to apply for that role. What was interesting when I got there was to see right there in central lobby, the four doors, above the four doors are images of the four saints, patron saints of the United Kingdom above the four doors. And in central lobby also on the floor in Latin, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that builds it. So it's right there. So when a parliamentarian once said to me, don't you think it's a bit out of place that, we should have faith stuff happening here? And I sort of looked at him and smiled and said, actually, I think you're the one who is out of place, because faith is in the very fabric of this building and part of its history. So my time in Parliament was an interesting one. And of course, towards the end of it, we had the dreaded Brexit that was there. But what for me was quite interesting is that thinking of Thomas Becket, it seems to me that at the heart of the conflict between the king and Becket seemed to have been something going on about power and who was going to get their own way. I don't know whether this was a sort of alpha male thing playing out, or whether there were really serious considerations being given to particular points. But certainly today, power is still very much at the heart of what happens politically. And I don't know whether it is true to say that within the church there are also, issues around power games being played. I suspect that it is. So there is nothing new under the sun. It is still happening, but perhaps happening in a different way than it did back then, because we don't have some of the same issues, direct issues, like, for example, landowners and in the same way that we had it back then, and their responsibility to the king. What we do have today, for example, which still links, is patronage. One of the things when we were in Parliament, I noticed when we were having apprentices in the same way that King Henry appointed Becket, in a sense, it was, you begin to see who are the apprentices that we're seeing in Parliament. And I know certainly that John, the speaker that was there when I was there, that he was always saying, how can we get not just the people from a wealthy background to be here acting, in an apprentice role, but how might we get people from places like Hackney, where I used to work as well, to get an opportunity to come in and be apprentices, as it were, in Parliament, and see what is happening there. A sense of how do we bring in a more diverse group instead of just the wealthy person's child who can afford to have some time out, who has no problems. Mommy and daddy will supply their, pay their lunch and their travel, etc. So there's a real sense in which there are some of those issues back then that still connects today in different ways, but it is still very, very much there and still needing to be addressed. For example, one more, and then I will stop. If you think about some of the things that Becket was saying, the king thought, if I appoint my person, then he will do what I want him to do. What he didn't reckon was that Becket was going to say, no, 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 and challenge him. The church today still tries to offer a prophetic role. And so sometimes there can be a clash with the state. We had that in the 80s with the Faith in the City report when, the church was challenging the government over certain of its practices and some of the issues around at that time. Today, we still have that, not just by the spiritual lords, the Lord spiritual in the House of Lords, but from the wider church, challenging the state with regards to the aid budget cuts. That's something that we're still challenging around immigration policy and how we treat migrants and refugees, challenges around welfare reforms, gambling policies. So there are still areas of tension between state and church that I hope we never run away from. Luckily, we don't see any violence as a consequence of church and state disagreement. And no one is expecting, our present Archbishop is not expecting to be attacked because he speaks out about certain things.
Thank you, Rose. I think what you just spoke about there, and this idea of power struggles that have continued, for centuries, is a really interesting aspect of Becket's legacy. I was going to ask you both about the role of the church in ceremonial state occasions, but I think because you've just been talking there exactly about this question of the relationship between church and state, I'd like instead to stick with that topic and think about the freedom of the church and the freedom of the rights of the church now, because of course that was a crucial question for Becket, and Rowan, as you mentioned when you were talking earlier, was also central to other aspects of English law, such as Magna Carta. So do you think that Becket and his supporters would see that the freedoms of the church are still being upheld today?
I think they probably would allow that this is a state in which the church remains, broadly speaking, free. People sometimes ask me whether after I stopped being Archbishop, I felt freer to make comments on public affairs than I had before, because I was the Archbishop of an established church whose position is protected in some ways by law. But I had to say, well, no, actually, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel when I was in office that I had any real constraint on what I could say. Rose is quite right. It wasn't all that likely that I would be set upon by knights in Canterbury Cathedral. But there are other kinds of attack. There are forms of verbal violence, which, Rose, you know at least as much about as anyone else in the Church of England for many reasons. There are forms of verbal violence that are still possible. And there have been countries in the world in our own lifetime where speaking up for the gospel has put people's lives, put the lives of Christian ministers at risk. So Becket certainly reminds us that this is not just a matter of academic historic interest. If I could just add one more thing, perhaps picking up something that Rose mentioned. Of course, part of the fascination of Becket in his own time and since then is that he was in his time an outsider. He didn't come from an aristocratic background. He was somebody who'd made it by talent and who was resented by people from the church and political establishment in many ways. It also explains the fact that so many people in his own area in Kent revered and trusted him as someone who wasn't just part of the baronial establishment. and who was concerned to keep the independence of the church, partly because the church was responsible for so much in terms of education and primary care for people, which couldn't just depend on the feudal landholding system. So Becket did stand for something of what Rose was talking about, even in his own day, and wasn't just defending the self-interest of the institution.
And I wonder also if I could just add, when you mentioned about the freedom of the church, one of the challenges, I think, for us in particular around the pandemic was freedom of worship during the pandemic, when churches were closed. There were restrictions enforced by legal sanctions on gatherings. There was, of course, a news report of the police in a church in somewhere, I think in Southern Diocese, ordering them to close things down. So, you know, there are some of those things. There's also provisions with regards to the Equality Act to enable churches to set its own employment criteria in limited situations in accordance with their institutional beliefs, and genuine occupational requirements for a person to be a practicing Christian in some roles. You know, there's great hesitancy and scrutiny around some of those areas. So there is still a sort of tension there in terms of state, church as well.
Interesting. And I want to turn now to this question about the role of the church in state occasions, because this was something that was very important to Becket. And I'll give the viewers a little bit of background to this for those who aren't aware. So Becket's right as Archbishop of Canterbury was to preside over coronation ceremonies, and it was something he was very protective of because it was his ancient right. And he was in exile for 6 years before his death. And because he was away, he was not available to preside over the coronation of Henry II's son, also called Henry. And the fact that the Archbishop of York and other English bishops presided over this ceremony was the straw that broke the camel's back in many ways for Becket in his very long and protracted dispute with Henry. And I wondered for both of you, Rose and Rowan, if you could reflect on your own experiences of the importance of the church's involvement in state ceremonies.
I will let the Archbishop go first. His direct experience.
Well, fortunately, I never had to do a coronation.
No.
But I was very conscious of the fact that national services marking some major national trauma or some watershed in national life were occasions where the church, and the Archbishop in particular, would be expected to step up and have something to say. And I found this one of the most significant and also one of the most testing areas of being Archbishop. Because when, for example, we had a service to commemorate the final withdrawal of troops from Iraq, when we had the service to commemorate the anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, when we had a service marking the deaths of those who died in the bombings in London, the terrorist acts in London. You know, to find something to say in those contexts, to make use of the extraordinary privilege, and it is a privilege that the church has, to be invited to speak into those events, that was hard, but also necessary. It was a recognition on the part of the state generally that there was a dimension to national life, to the social life of this country, that was not just covered by being a citizen, not just covered by paying your taxes, not just covered by who you voted for, but something else. And to be able to speak into that, as I say, was an enormous challenge. I remember, if I can drop a name, on one occasion after a particularly complex commemoration, which had required a lot of hard labor and wet towels around the head, I remember being teased by the late Prince Philip about how the Archbishop had to get used to having what he called all the bloody difficult assignments thrown in his direction. But But that does go with the territory in a sense. And the establishment of the church by law is not a straightforward matter, and not something which in principle I'd want to go to the wire for. But what it does mean is that there is an expectation that a perspective from the spiritual, a perspective ultimately from the gospel for a Christian, can be brought in to public life. You don't have to expect everyone to agree with it, sign up to it, but nonetheless it has a claim to be visible and to be audible at those moments.
And if I may just add to that by saying, you mentioned that it is a privilege. It is a privilege that comes with a huge responsibility to actually ensure that you're setting the right tone at that particular time. So you're not calling for vengeance and, or for blood, but that you're setting the right tone again around issues to do with forgiveness and reconciliation, and actually representing Christ in that situation. So it is an honor, but it comes with a huge responsibility. And sometimes I must say, I've heard so many people saying, oh, the church has no business relating to politics, or the church should be disestablished. I would like us to think about the opportunities to serve, the opportunities to challenge, and to be taken seriously. Because I must admit that the Church of England, and I'm very proud of the Church of England here, is that they do a terrific job when it comes to officiating at some of those services that the Archbishop has just mentioned.
I wonder, Naomi, if I could just add one more comment on the history, again, as a sort of bridging thing, because Becket was, as you say, driven to extreme measures because other bishops had been invited in to do what he thought was his job. And the bishops in question, especially the then Archbishop of York and the then Bishop of London, were not particularly impressive figures. And the Bishop of London was clearly a rather pompous character, and the Archbishop of York was rather worse than that, if all the stories about him at the time were true. But that's not the point. I think Becket was saying, you can't play politics with coronations. The anointing of the monarch in a solemn ceremony representing the Christian commonwealth, the Christian community, is so significant you can't just mess around with it and turn it into a point-scoring exercise for one group in the church or another. And I think that sense that you don't play politics with public affairs, it's a rather paradoxical thing to say, but it's exactly where the difficult responsibility that Rose was talking about comes in. You have to find ways of exercising that responsibility, setting a tone that is not about political point scoring or anything of that sort, not a partisan voice.
Yes, and that's vital, because during my almost 10 years as chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons, I don't believe, as a matter of fact, I believe it was Jeremy Hunt at my farewell, who was then the foreign affairs. He said that the way I responded to all of them, they wouldn't know which party I supported. And I felt quite pleased about that, because I am there for all of them, including the staff and the security team that's there as well. That does not mean that I don't have very strong political views, but that's to be kept to myself in many ways, and so that it enables me to function as a chaplain to not just to John Berker, who was the then speaker while I was there, but to all the parliamentarians in both houses.
That's a really interesting point I think you make there, Rose, about neutrality. because that's something that in many ways Becket was not. He was not neutral, and that greatly frustrated Henry II because he wished that he would be. So is that something that's quite difficult to achieve, do you think, as in the church today?
Well, I'm not sure that Henry wanted Becket to be neutral. Henry wanted Becket to be his man.
Yes, you're quite right.
Very often when people say we want more political neutrality from the church, the subtext is they want the church to be on their side, just as when people would exhort the Archbishop sometimes to show more leadership. What they really meant was we'd like the Archbishop to tell other people that we're right. So it's not exactly neutrality we're talking about either. It's trying to do two things at once, which are quite hard to balance. On the one hand, to speak for what the church regards as the priorities of the gospel and Christian ethics. Not to say everyone has to believe this, but to say this is what we're here to say. Not to, as I say, not to score points or not to score victories, but this is what we're here to say, and we have to say it. And on the other hand, not to mix that in with the horse trading and negotiating that's, of course, part of practical government and actual party politics. So not neutral in the sense of never taking a stand on things, but not partisan in the sense of saying the church is endorsing this program and this program alone.
Yes. The partisan is not acceptable in that role, and I think it's really important and very clear for those who want to serve in that space, but always to be true to what faith is telling us in that context, to speak truth to power, as it were, but not to do it from the perspective of the Sun newspaper, but instead to do it as Nathan the prophet did. And in the story of Nathan the prophet, Nathan was concerned about what King David was doing. And so he gets alongside the king and tells the king a story about a man who has been treated unjustly. And the king is absolutely enraged to hear about it and says, I want to know who this person is who has been behaving so badly. And Nathan very gently said to him, you are that man. So, in a sense, that's how I saw my role while I was chaplain.
I wonder if now we could turn to a broader question about learning from Thomas Becket today. And that needn't just be the dispute, but what lessons do you both think that we could learn from Becket and Henry's dispute, or from Thomas Becket that could be applied to the relationship between the church and the state in our time?
But it's not an easy crossover, but two things come to mind. One, of course, is that Becket didn't just talk about the distinctive identity of the church. When he became Archbishop and realized that he was now on the front line, so to speak, his lifestyle changed quite dramatically. He started wearing a hair shirt. Nowadays, we don't need hair shirts. We have journalists to do that for us. But he changed his lifestyle. He made a habit of personally ministering to the poor in Canterbury, washing the feet of beggars in Canterbury Cathedral. That kind of thing. He knew that it had to be more than just either the defense of the privileges of an institution or pious words about the church's sanctity and difference. You had to show something. And I don't think Becket found it easy. He wasn't a naturally patient and possibly not even a naturally very pious man. He was a man of strong passions, strong opinions, short temper, a great one for standing on his dignity, and not much sense of humor. And not an easy man at all. Even his best friends threw up their hands in despair over him at times. The little group of intensely loyal friends who supported him so much, like John of Salisbury, the great political philosopher, there were times when they would just say he's impossible to live with. Yet this difficult, angular personality gritted his teeth and tried to live like a Christian. He tried to do what it said in the rule book, to care for the poor, to pray, to mortify his body, to lead a life of self-denial. And that, well, it hardly needs saying that if the church is going to talk about its difference, its holiness, its dignity, even its freedom, then somehow the church needs, and its leaders need, to live out as best they can that self-denying, self-giving, often risky lifestyle that's implied in all this, and have to encourage congregations to look at their practice, at their habits, at how much they're prisoners of their comfort zones. So yes, Becket's hair shirt does still have a little something to say to us.
And what I would add to that is that somehow, how do we hold that aspect that Archbishop Rowan has just spoken about? How do we hold that aspect together alongside reconciliation? Where are the voices? Because yes, we do those things that tries to draw us into a place of holiness, but how do we reconcile with our neighbor? And for me today, at the heart of the church still struggles to be reconciled together. And I think it's our Achilles heel, because what the world says to us is, I can't hear what you're saying because of what I can see you doing. And that's a real problem for us. Here in Canterbury Diocese, we have the strapline, changed lives, changing lives. So the lives that we lead, which is, yes, the seeking and the desiring of holiness through our prayer life, our life of prayer, through our life of service, must also show that side of being reconciled one to another. Christ prayed for that unity. And it seems to me that we must work even harder together and strive for that unity as well.
It's very interesting that at various points in the historical controversy, who you exchange the kiss of peace with at Holy Communion was a really rather delicate question. There were moments where the King and Becket came within a manageable distance of agreement, and it depended on exchanging the solemn ritual kiss of peace, and it wasn't possible, and things moved back to square one. Symbols matter, and the church, of course, knows that symbols matter. And I'm thinking, as Rose is talking, of the experience of South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how extraordinarily hard it is for a Christian leader in that context, like, of course, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to speak both for truth and for reconciliation, both for a really costly honesty about the failings and sins of a society, and about a possibility that still exists of having a future together.
Yes.
And that's a very hard thing.
I think those 2 points of truth and reconciliation are two interesting and very moving aspects of Becket's legacy. And of course, though we're talking about a dispute here, and even the blurb for the event online talks about dispute, actually reconciliation is at the very heart of Becket's legacy. Now, we're about to move on to public questions, but before we do, I wanted to turn to the question of place in Becket's cult, and the places of both Canterbury and Dover, which you both know very well. They were, of course, central to Becket's cult in the Middle Ages, and I wondered if you could both reflect on how important these two places are to the church in modern day England, and are there any parallels between then and now?
I'm going to let you go first, Archbishop, on this.
Well, one of the things about Becket's cult was that it became immediately an international affair, a European story, not just an English one. And I was always conscious in my time at Canterbury of the role that Canterbury played for so many people across the world because of its central position in the story of the Anglican Communion, the worldwide family of Anglican churches, and the gathering every 10 years or so of Anglican leaders from around the world for the Lambeth Conference. That takes place in Canterbury. The cathedral plays a very central role. And whenever I entered the cathedral, in my time as Archbishop, I was aware of that, the way in which it's the focus of the prayers and thoughts of people right across the world who would be very unlikely to find themselves in southeastern England in a hurry, and yet would think of this as a place which had something to say to them, something to do with them. And I'll never forget the spectacle of the Melanesian dancers who were there at the opening of the last Lambeth Conference, dancing as they brought in the gospel. And the fact that as an image sticks with me very powerfully. The gospel being brought in to us by those with whom we once shared the gospel. We hear the word back from them, from these communities of apparent strangers, which of course bridges into the other thing that makes Dover so significant in our society, and I know Rose will have a lot to say about this, the point at which migrants arrive, the point at which, if you like, we are as a country challenged about what we're going to say to and do with strangers who arrive among us. Are we going to be welcoming? Are we going to be panicky?
Yes, here in the Diocese of Canterbury, I think we would like to think that we feel a sense of responsibility to hold a mirror up to the rest of our country, to say these people who are coming in, they're human beings, they're part of God's creation, and we need to offer them welcome. We need to extend an arm of welcome to show them love, instead of shouting that they're not real refugees, they are economic migrants, because I am quick to respond to that by saying that the British were economic migrants when it went all over the world. They weren't going because, they were running away from famine or war. They were going in order to make a better life for themselves and their families. And so, we personally in the diocese are committed to the work that we do with refugees when they come in at port in Dover, and that commitment is a long-lasting one. In terms of pilgrimage still goes on. Unfortunately, I came here after I was consecrated in November of 2019, so only 3.5 months in, and then we've had lockdown. So we've not seen the physical movements in terms of pilgrimage during that time, but I'm very consciously aware that people have been coming, a trickle here and there. It is very much still a place of pilgrimage. A place of refuge, as it were.
Thank you both. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions we have from our attendees. And to kick off, I wanted to ask you both about role models. Now, Thomas Becket, an aspect of his legacy throughout the Middle Ages was that he was seen as a great role model for church leaders, particularly for Archbishops of Canterbury up until Thomas Cranmer, but also for church figures, not just in England, but across the continent as well. So I wondered who you think would be good role models for members of the church today, and that could still be St. Thomas of Canterbury.
Well, I'd certainly put in a word for Becket still being a role model for all that, as I say, he's an angular and difficult personality. There's something about that final integrity and courage which never fails to move, and the story that's told in the exhibition is a story that still grips people very, very immediately. And for me, within my own lifetime, I've heard the stories told of two Christian leaders who have, in effect, given their lives, as Becket did, not just for the freedom of the church, but for the freedom of God's children more broadly. I'm thinking of Archbishop Janani Luwum in Uganda, who died at the hands of Idi Amin's equivalent to the knights who killed Thomas Becket. I'm thinking of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was shot while saying Mass at the altar. And both of these were people who, a little bit like Becket, when they started out, didn't particularly want to be martyrs or prophets, but found that the pressure of where they were and who God was for them made them into witnesses, forced them, you might say, to take the risks that they took, gave them the courage and the depth which carried them through to those last terrible moments. And I have a very vivid memory of a memorial event a few years ago for Oscar Romero, who is now, of course, a saint of the Roman Catholic Church, which began with a recording of his last sermon being played. It was the sermon in which he had explicitly denounced the death squads which were killing activists and poor people in Salvador at the time. And he makes a direct plea and says to the soldiers involved, throw down your weapons, just stop it, stop the killing. And he says it in such simple, direct words. And a few days after that, he was murdered. Mm. Now, Romero is someone who allowed himself to be taught by the people he ministered to. If you like, speaking in Christian terms, God, through those people, gave him the courage he needed to go on standing up for their freedom and their dignity. And he is, to my mind, the great modern equivalent of Thomas Becket.
Yes, I think those two definitely stands out for me. But also at the last Lambeth conference, the brothers in South America who were murdered, I remember towards the end of that service, our final service, that amazing movement from the nave all the way up to the high altar, the chapel right at the very back. Is it the Martyrs' Chapel, I think?
That's right, the Martyrs' Chapel.
Yes, and that was just so deeply moving that stayed with me. And I think with regards to courage, I know Desmond Tutu is still with us. Thank God for that. But for me, in terms of someone living that I know of, have met, that he is a great role model of Christian living, yes, in our present time.
Thank you both. Well, I have a question here again from an attendee, and it's Tristan Taylor. I hope you don't mind me saying your name. His question is, Professor John Hudson went on recording claiming that Becket was the founder of gesture politics and the master of the soundbite. Do you think this is a fair evaluation of his legacy? And given the rise of populism globally, do you think he would be popular now, or would he be seen as a radical? It's a very interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. Certainly, Becket knew emphatically the value of a dramatic gesture. He was very good at dramatic gestures. And part of what makes his stories so extraordinarily attractive and lively these days is just that he did know how to make an effective theatrical gesture. And you could say that, yes, he did stage his martyrdom. He knew perfectly well he was going to die. And it's as if he took a deep breath that winter afternoon in Canterbury and said, all right, I'm going to die. Frankly, how do I make the most of it for the sake of what I believe in? So he does stage that. Populism is an interesting concept, isn't it, here? Becket certainly appealed to people who were alienated and disillusioned by their immediate feudal superiors. And when in his exile, his lands and his tenants were taken over by secular rivals, those secular rivals certainly made life very uncomfortable for Becket's tenants and his family and a lot of the peasantry of the area. Becket was seen as someone who could be relied on, not just to squeeze the life out of his lands and his tenants. So he was popular. He came back from exile on a wave of popularity. At the same time, he was somebody who lived constantly with what I referred to earlier, the disapproval, the alienation, the contempt of a lot of those who might have been his social equals in some ways. So not, I think, a demagogue, not somebody who would naturally get a crowd following him, but somebody who knew how to keep loyalty, not just the loyalty of his friends, but the loyalty of his flock as well. And that says something, because I think there's a big difference between being a populist demagogue who can whip up a crowd and being somebody who maintains trust and fidelity on the part of other people over a long period.
I think the Archbishop has done justice to that question.
Thank you. Okay, here's another one from an anonymous contributor. And they say, is there any criteria or occasions when you believe the law of the state should take precedent over the ecclesiastical law? For instance, I can remember occasions, i.e. David Cameron stating that the government would legislate for women to enter the episcopate if the church would not. Would either of you like to answer that question?
Rose, I think. You start.
I think that I would not want us to be setting things up as a clash, as it were. We belong to this country together. The church is part of the life of this country. At the moment, it is the established church. And so even our church law, so to speak, if I'm not correct, please do correct me, Archbishop, goes through Parliament as well. So I think the more we can work together to ensure that we're not having the kind of clashes that puts us at odds with each other. Would I have been excited if Cameron had said, yes, a law should be passed that women should be bishops? Why not? Of course I would be happy about that. But then the church has got to wrestle with that itself, because at the end of the day, the church has got to make it work.
I think that's the bottom line, really. In many ways, I would have been very glad to see a shortcut of that kind. But the point is, the church is a voluntary body of people who accept certain things binding on their conscience. And for the state to legislate about people's consciences and conscientiously held beliefs is a step too far. I believe that that's the road to totalitarianism. And so I would say that there may be questions where the church's integrity, the church's loyalty to itself has to take precedence. And I think here again of South Africa and the very difficult moment in the 50s when the Bantu Education Act was passed and segregated education began, and the then Anglican Archbishop in Cape Town, with great reluctance, signed a document saying, we cannot accept this, we cannot run our schools on this basis, so we will close our schools rather than accept the state's orders on this.
Thank you. I have quite a specific question now for you, Rose, which was about in 2016, the relic of Becket that came to the UK from Esztergom in Hungary. And I believe you were in Parliament when it was shown in St Mary's Undercroft. So what was that experience like, having a relic of Becket brought into the heart of Parliament?
I sit very lightly with relics, I'm afraid, So, there is a respect for those who it carries much more meaning, but it sits very lightly with me, and in particular, the Roman Catholics in Parliament were there in great numbers for that service, that gathering. But it is not, I don't go for relics or anything like that personally. Yeah. But I respect those who think that this is important for them.
Well, I'm much more of a superstitious peasant than Rose, I'm afraid, and I always relished the tactile succession of here is something which really physically represents a continuing history. So I get a little bit more excited about relics, I think, than you do, and I was sorry to miss out on that occasion. Personally.
What is interesting in here in the Canterbury Diocese, we have a church, St. Mary at Eansworth, and actually her bones were found in the church. I was a little bit more excited about that, and perhaps the reason I was excited about that, because here was a woman in leadership years and years and years ago, and so I was a little bit more excited about that.
Thank you. We've got about 2 minutes left for the event, so I have a historical question that Rowan, perhaps you could answer, and then if we have some more time, I'll ask one more question. But this is from Paul, and he asks, is there any evidence of Becket's piety before he became Archbishop?
Not a great deal, to be honest. The lives certainly suggest that he had a fairly extravagant lifestyle as effectively a young civil servant, a high flyer in the civil service who got to be Lord Chancellor of the country at a very young age. There are no very lurid stories about him, but equally nothing much to suggest that he'd suddenly start wearing a hair shirt. So we do have to take quite seriously, I think, the notion that when he became Archbishop, something about the nature of the role, something about where he was, came home to him in a quite new way. And that's one of the things I find quite moving in his story.
I guess that was his Damascus Road experience.
But I think of the words of Thomas More in Robert Bolt's play A Man for All Seasons, where More says at one point to his wife, "This is not the stuff of which martyrs are made, but the commitments he's made and the person he is just drive him inexorably towards the risk of martyrdom."
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I think we don't actually have time for any additional questions. So it leaves for me to thank you both so much for taking part in a fascinating and very rich and full discussion. So thank you both, Rose and Rowan, for taking part today. It's a real pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you.
And for those of you at home, if you enjoyed this event and you would like to learn more about the exhibition, as I said at the beginning, it's on until the 22nd of August, so please do book your tickets if you would like to come. And if you would like to find out more, also we have an associated book, there we go, about the exhibition, and that discusses aspects of Becket's cult in more detail as well. And if you would like to join us for the next event in our series, that is on very soon. In fact, it is on next Wednesday at 5:30 via Zoom. And you can find details on the British Museum's events page. And that will be a discussion with Professor Marion Turner and the poet Patience Agbabi, Chaucer Telling Tales. So that will be a really interesting event, and do look out for it. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, and goodbye to all of you at home.
Thank you. Thanks.